Good afternoon, everyone. Today is October 24th, 2023. It's 1 p.m. This is a Prescott City Council study session. Can we start with roll call? City Clerk?
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Here.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
Councilman Sishka.
Here.
And Councilman Tenney.
Yes.
All are present.
Very good. Today is on our study session. We have one item on our agenda. It's an update and a discussion regarding potential land acquisitions surrounding Prescott Regional Airport, Ernest A. Love Field.
Great. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Today's item is to discuss those potential land acquisitions around the airport that are necessary for the protection of the airport itself, as well as the residents and citizens in the surrounding area. So, starting on this, I'm going to take a slightly different seat, as typically it's not the city manager who presents these, but it's an important enough issue. I think it's one that I felt I needed to present on. I will have Mark Woodfill come up. There will be a point at this where we talk a little bit about numbers, and I'll have Mark Woodfill come up and kind of walk us through those, as he is very familiar with how we do things in Prescott. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we are in current discussions with a number of the landowners, and many of whom are in the audience today. And while the council has had many updates and discussions on the progress of these negotiations in executive session, this is the first time really that the general public is getting an opportunity to see some of the broader plans for the potential land acquisitions. However, it should be noted that many of the concepts that are going to be discussed have been shared in various public meetings over the course of the last 2 years or so, and have formed the basis for much of what the council's direction has been as it relates to airport protections. So with that, we can go ahead and get started. Let's see if I can make it work here. There we go. To give you a sense of the agenda today, it goes without saying that this council and many councils before you have recognized the need to support the growth and development of the Prescott Regional Airport. So we will take a look at some of the planning efforts that have formed our path forward. We will then spend a little bit of time discussing airport protection, its benefits, and the rationale for seeking acquisition of sensitive areas around the airport. To help ground us, and that's no pun intended on that, we will take a look at a few maps to help visualize the areas and the locations and the attributes that we are targeting for further protections. And then I will turn it over to Mr. Woodfill, who will provide a financial overview, including an early look at the city's general fund forecast and some of the financial impacts associated with that. And lastly, I would encourage council discussion and appreciate any direction you may have on this. It is a study session, so again, there is no action on this, and we can go ahead and get started. Any questions leading up? Okay. All right. So when we review some of the guidance documents that have been put in place over the years, one of the first places we look at is our voter-approved general plan. The most current plan was adopted in 2015 and has over 145 references to the airport. You think our folks are interested? I think we have some interest in the airport. So some of the pertinent statements include that the airport is a substantial transportation and economic asset. The airport land use protection must be addressed to assure the protection and economic vitality of the airport. The airport master plan, the airport business plan, and the 2001 airport specific area plans were all adopted at the time this went into place to address airport land use protections and to assure the continued economic vitality of the airport. And lastly, the general plan also noted that specific area plans where they exist do supersede the general plan when it comes to a plan and review, which takes us to the next item, which is the airport specific area plan. This was originally adopted in 2001. The airport specific area plan included policies regarding the future uses of development of properties in the vicinity of the airport and would take into consideration the recommendations of the airport specific area plan. That plan defined the airport influence areas, the airport impact zones, noise contours, and it identified certain land use protections around the airport. In 2013, update also included restrictions on permitting residential land uses in the airport impact zones 1 through 5 and within the 60 DNL noise contour, which I'll cover in a little bit what those items are. It was also discovered in 2021 that the crosswind runway, and we'll talk about that when I get to the impact zones, was inaccurately drawn at the time, and that created a situation where potentially incompatible land uses would be available in zones 2 and 3 of the crosswind runway. And likewise, the council has expressed through your council goals the priorities that you have for the airport, which were to create a compatible zoning around the airport through strategic land acquisitions, infrastructure, and to bolster the airport area and business growth and job creation around the airport. So as you can see, the city has always had an intent and a goal to protect the airport through its policy documents and council priorities. All right. With the planning efforts, with those planning efforts in place, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific airport protections that have been discussed, debated, and ultimately recommended for consideration when making land use, or in this case, land acquisition decisions. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. The first one is to having to push this and speak at the same time. The first one is the airport impact zones. What are they? These airport impact zones are generally located at the ends of the runways, as you can see on the map on the right there, where the majority of airplane incidents and accidents occur. So they're basically protection zones or protection areas. The intents of those are to restrict some of the land uses that are considered incompatible with the safe operation of the aircraft. And each zone has recommended land use restrictions to address safety on the air and in the ground, obstructions and height limitations, recommendations on densities or intensities of uses, noise and overflight compatibility, as well as even some considerations for wildlife habitats that might be within those areas. And while there are uses that are allowed within some of these impact zones, they are typically low-intensity uses with minimal obstructions. So you can see on here, that is our airport, going kind of from the lower left to the upper right is the southwest approach or the southwest departure, and then the crosswind runway runs from the lower right to the upper left. So next we'll look at we'll look at noise compatibility. The Prescott Regional Airport is one of the busiest regional airports in the country. I think we've learned that not only with our existing general aviation, but with all of the Embry-Riddle training that goes on out at that site, as well as our commercial service and our Forest Service work that is done out there. And due to the high number of annual operations at the airport, it is recommended that communities consider the noise impacts of overflights when making land use decisions. That's part of the best practice from the FAA. To the right, you can see what is considered in more recent studies, I think this one was conducted in 2021, the percent of residents perceived annoyance with overflight noise. And in this study, it was noted that that level of annoyance has increased over time. So prior studies had it, people didn't quite feel as bad. Now it appears that people are getting a little bit more annoyed. Maybe that's just the nature of our environment these days, of people feeling they can express those things widely. With this information, the Federal Aviation Regulations on Noise Compatibility recommend communities establish noise contours to account for the type and frequency of flights occurring on the airport. So in support of this concept, as I mentioned before, the airport specific area plan supported keeping those new residential and other sensitive uses outside of airport impact zones 1 through 5 and outside of what's called the 60 DNL. This is the OEI splay, and as you can see pictured to the right, this is a composite splay basically of departure routes coming off of the main runway to the southwest. The protection of the splay is important as it provides a clear path to return to the airport in the event the aircraft loses an engine, so there needs to be a safe route for them. It also is a determinant factor to understand the height limitations within certain landforms coming out of the airport, and is to remain free from obstacles that would impair any kind of aircraft operations. So when we look kind of at all three of those concepts have been discussed over the past several years and were brought forward by staff in the creation of the airport vicinity overlay, or in the recommendation of an airport vicinity overlay. This is not an approved plan at this time, but it has gone through the Planning and Zoning Commission with a 5-1 recommendation to come forward for council for approval. The above airport protections were discussed over multiple planning and zoning sessions, so if anybody really wants to learn the ins and outs and the details about all these things, certainly I am sure that there is some video out there. But keeping new residential and other highly sensitive uses outside of the 60 DNL contour and the impact zones, provides that level of protection. So this is basically an overlay. You can see DNLs, which are kind of the black lines on there. You can see the airport impact zones kind of outlined in there. And then as you just kind of look further to the southeast, you can, the splay continues kind of to the southeast there. It should be noted that as part of the planning and zoning recommendations, the area in blue there, the Deep Well Ranch, was exempted from the AVO. So as that has been in addition to some of the Prescott-specific goals, there are broader community goals that are worth discussing. Obviously, from a community standpoint, having an airport means that we are investing in that overall operation, and we are, as Prescott citizens and as residents, it can be a point of pride, but it also is something we have to take care of. It's an asset in our community that we need to take care of. So we want to ensure that we are enhancing all the safety issues around the airport, both on the ground and the air. We're ensuring access to the national air transportation system. We want to ensure that the airlines and the Forest Service and flight training, all of those things are important elements that occur out at our airport. We want to help to mitigate future encroachment and minimize some of the noise and overflight, preserve this as an economic engine. I think we've had many conversations, or at least council's been presented much information about kind of the economic return of an airport in a community like Prescott. So land use decisions that conflict with some of that aviation activity in airport facilities can result in undue constraints being placed on an airport. One thing I want to note is that while many of these things had been in place and have been in place, conditions change over time. And so what we've seen in the last 5 years or so is that noise contours have extended further out beyond the initial noise contours. Impact zones, you wanting to have some, understanding of what's allowable in those impact zones, and certainly wanting to ensure long-term safety. So as conditions change, we've evolved in our conversation about what airport protection means to the city of Prescott. So I'm going to move forward. Any questions on that before I move forward to some of the proposed acquisitions? See none? Going. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the proposed acquisitions that council is considering or may be considering. From an airport protection standpoint, we've got 3 locations: the southwest approach, the north approach, and the east approach, all of which we're trying to create secure those greater protections than we had to ensure the long-term viability of the airport. And then there's one site that I'll talk about, which is called the north site. It's really, I'll talk a little bit more, but that's to help further the potential expansion of the runway at the airport. So this is the airport layout plan. This just kind of gives a context. I'm doing this more for visual representation. Generally, when we talk about the southwest approach, the north approach, and the east approach, you can see those on there. Those areas in purple are generally the areas that we're targeting for some land acquisition. That doesn't include all of them, but it includes a number of those. And then you can see the north site in green there. That's the one that is more for airport expansion, for a future potential runway expansion. So I just wanted to give some context as to where these are located within the airport layout area. So the first, let me get to this page. So the first area is the southwest approach. As described earlier, this is the primary takeoff for the majority of flights, or a good number of flights at the airport. Planes depart to the southwest. Certainly our commercial airlines use this as their takeoff. Planes depart to the southwest and carry over the area that's shown on this map. So you can see kind of coming off the airport, kind of flying over those areas that you see in yellow and red. The majority of the parcels under consideration for purchase on this approach are within the airport impact zone boundaries. So what you see on here, the yellow, are areas that have been identified for potential purchase, and the areas in red and green are proposed to be protected open space. I should say red is protected open space, and a little bit of green kind of in those black outlined areas. Those are the city's wishes for that area, and the benefit of purchasing these parcels really is to ensure the safety, minimize the height obstructions, and remove residential uses primarily from those outside, the two on the bottom, the two yellow parcels that are on the bottom there. This is the north approach. Sorry, I keep forgetting to push my button. And this is north of the crosswind runway. So you have to kind of turn the map in your head. You got to turn it to the right a little bit to see the north piece there. But this is kind of heading from the southeast to the northwest. This is a 75-acre parcel in the yellow, just south of the future hospital and east of Highway 89, to kind of give you a context of the area. And as mentioned, in 2021, it was discovered that there was a discrepancy. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but there was a discrepancy in the drawing of the crosswind impact zones. So if you look at the map as it is right now, that area in yellow was not originally drawn in as part of the impact zones. The inaccurate map was relied upon both when Deep Well Ranch was entitled and made residential uses allowable in the area. The consultant who made the error later corrected the map. However, the land had already been sold and development plans were already underway for that area. So while there are considerably fewer flights potentially in the crosswind runway, usually that's when the winds shift and the crosswind has to be used, or potentially some of our training flights go through there. The area is located within Zone 2 and 3. And it is also within the 60 DNL, and the proposed residential uses make this parcel a high priority acquisition for the city. Talk a little bit about the east end of the airport. So this is the very far east end of the airport, typically where most airplanes are coming in for landing. You can see on this aerial the Granite Creek kind of traversing kind of north-south through there. The area in yellow has been identified as the approach protection area. You can see that it also includes primarily zones 1 and a little bit of zone 2. And in our development agreement with the AED, Arizona Eco Development, the city has agreed that we would purchase those 130 acres and they would contribute the surrounding 270 acres, creating an appropriate and protected buffer on the east end of the airport. So if needed in the future, this site might also be used to extend the runway to serve larger air carriers if that option comes to the community. The last site is the north site, and the land is owned by the Chino Valley Irrigation District. This land is a strategic purchase that really serves more of a dual purpose. It's closer. It is close to the shorter general aviation runway, as you can see right there, and would be a great location for a safe complex in partnership with our training partners and Embry-Riddle. And then additionally, the dirt on this site could be used as fill in the event that the city ever does choose to extend the runway. The dirt from this site can be offset in the costs of extending the runway, or we can sell that dirt, or we can use it as a match. So it's a opportune site for us to purchase. Any questions on those acquisitions? Again, just kind of showing the larger airport layout plan. Okay. So again, just sort of talking through these, each of these acquisition areas come with some benefits. They also certainly come with costs, and they come with, but they also can help generate a better product potentially, and a better community out around the airport. So, there's certainly pros and cons. Some of these things are tough things that councils have to wrestle with, but one of the big things you have to wrestle with is some of the costs associated with these. So I'd like to ask Mark Woodfield to come up and talk a little bit about the cost of the land, the trade-offs, or the estimated cost of the land. There's some of the trade-offs, particularly as it relates to some of the other important council policies. And before I set you loose, got one more thing, but the city, I just want to, when we talk about a financial overview, I think it's important to kind of lay the context around what we're talking about here. And I would say that the city of Prescott has a long history of very prudent financial policies and principles to ensure that the long-term stability is the long-term financial stability, while also remaining or maintaining what I would consider a very low tax burden. So those are important points, and I think values that the community has had over the years. The City Council has also established goals related to maintaining a healthy general fund, supporting competitive compensation plans in order to, bring in and retain employees, as well as improving public safety response times, and a number of other council priorities that I think have been brought up and are part of your council goals. So what did these have to do, with the purchase of land around the airport? I think the long answer is that the council has a number of important but competing priorities, and it is faced with some tough choices. The short answer is that something is likely going to have to give. That means that to do one thing, you might not be able to do others. So in the next few slides, I would like Mark to walk us through some of the initial cost estimates for purchasing the land around the airport, and then he'll give an early look on the general fund forecast and available funding. And lastly, he'll provide some context around some of the fiscal impacts that we might likely be faced with. So I'm going to pass the baton. Oh, you've got one up there.
I got my own baton.
All right, all yours.
Thank you, City Manager Gregory. As we figure out which button goes forward and which one goes back, here we go. So acquisition costs, these are estimates, obviously estimates. City manager and city attorney have been working very hard with the property owners associated with this, trying to get costs together. But again, we're talking about a lot of land. We're talking about four, I believe, different property owners that we're trying to get costs on, and a lot of factors that weigh into that. And we've also had some expenditures to date. So an estimate, a guess, where we are today, just for discussion purposes and for planning purposes, just under $23 million in our estimate, 22, get one of these screens close enough I can see it, 916. So as we look at how we pay for that, Dr. Sabata and her staff have been working hard to get grants and other things that can help defray these costs to protect the airport. And working with her, I guess it was last week we were working together trying to get the timing on these and the likelihood of these. We came up with these various grants. There's highly likely and there's likely. The highly likely are federal grants, or federal bill money. Is that, I'm looking for nods from, yeah. So the bill money, which is very likely, highly likely is the term we decided to choose. And then we have some ADOT kind of commitments, depending on if the funds are available, which are likely, still likely, all good. These things are spread out over the next 4 years, these returns. So if we look at 3 different scenarios, which is our goal here, is if we don't get any grants, what would that mean? If we get the highly likely ones, which are as I think Robin said, 99% confident, but no guarantees. Also, the schedule she sent me back in red had there are no guarantees on the bottom of it. So that is something to keep in mind. And then the ADOT money, which I've heard councilmen refer to as fat chance or likely, depending on the budget constraints of our state legislature for the ADOT monies. We have three different numbers there, the 22.9, the 17.8, which was what the city share would be if all the highly likely came in, and the estimates are right, and of course the likely would get us down to 9 million or 9.1. There are other potentials that didn't rate, I guess, likely enough to get on there, congressional bill money, other things that might come up, but at some point you got to draw a line at what you can plan for. So as we look at our general fund projections to see where this comes from, because of course Robin and her staff have been doing a great job trying to make the airport as self-sufficient as it can be, but the airport still has trouble covering its own operating costs in years that it doesn't have operating grants. So any debt that is issued for this land is going to have to be funded through the general fund. So we look at our general fund projection. Our general fund is our biggest fund. It's our fund that has the most diverse uses. It also has over 3,700 different revenue and expense accounts. For doing a projection, it takes a couple minutes because we could just throw a percentage at it, but that won't work. We go through each individual account and we determine, is this level, is this up, is this down? And our percentage change range from -5% to +5%, depending on the different funds. So again, we didn't jump into this lightly. These projections do include the state's decision that taxing residential rentals was unfair, and so they took it away from us. It does include the state's decision that income taxes were too high and they should be a standard rate across the board, all of which the legislature is now going to have to deal with in their own budgets. It has estimated growth in the revenues and expenditures.
Mayor Pro Tem, you have a question?
I do, Mayor. Thank you. Mark?
Yes, sir.
I'm curious, do these projections that you have include the possibility of a recession and its impacts on our general fund revenues over the next few years?
It depends. Just to be totally clear, it totally depends.
Well, let me clarify my question for you, Mark. Does it include the projection of a possibility of a 2008-like event happening in the next 4 years?
It does not include the possibility of a 2008 event happening.
In terms of the economic impact
that
had on our
level
community.
of a recession, you got to understand and I'm sure you do, the level of that recession was off the charts. It does take into account the cycles of the economy we have seen here in Prescott since I've been tracking them, which is about the last 35, 40 years. And we do take into account that we have up years and we have down years. And I send a revenue report to you guys every month, and this year is looking pretty flat right now.
Mark, can I ask you another question, since you do have that basis of understanding, having been with the city for a long period of time? What tends to happen to grant money when we go through recessionary periods like that? Does it continue to flow like milk and honey, or does it tighten up a little bit?
Federal grants are more solid than state grants. As we all know, the state loves to sweep everything because they have better ideas for it. And we have seen them sweep ADOT monies in the past. Whether they'll do that again or not, they constantly sweep HERF monies, which is what we use for our roads, whether it's a direct sweep, which they've done, or whether it's, I guess we're going to pay for DPS out of HERF monies now. Sweeps like that, kind of indirect sweeps, they do all those things. So state grants are less likely, federal grants are more likely to continue on.
Thank you for that clarification.
They print the money. So, all right. It does have a conservative capital projection in there. Does it have matches for large grants? No. Does it have building a new fire station? As we see in the bottom half here, it does not include building a new fire station. It does not include any additional patrol routes that we haven't already done. We've added a lot of police officers in the last 2 years. So it doesn't include any new ones over the 5 years that we projected. It doesn't include parks. You might have looked at the agenda, but later today we're going to be looking at some open space, which kind of had a gateway park associated with it. We do not have those costs in there because council has not given an absolute word that we're moving forward on that. Council has also talked about additional library branches. These projections do not have that in there. And of course, it doesn't include the projection doesn't include the purchase of land. Our scenarios we're going to look at does include service of debt for that. And also, as the Mayor Pro Tem pointed out, or I did, I can't remember who, the state is in a budget crisis because of their long-term view of short-term gains of revenue. And it does not include the state deciding that 17% of income tax is too high for cities and sweeping some of our other revenues, which are very likely, which is how we fund our operations. So with all that excitement, let's go ahead and start looking at these. This is the projection with, as we described, nothing in it but the continued operation of the general fund the way it is. The line that you see there is our projection of revenues, conservative, looking at the cycles of the economy over the last lot of years. 2008 was a unique, not unique, it was a severe recession. You generally don't see those all that often, but again, it is not in these projections because it would be of little use for much else if I did that. Our operating budgets are significant to do public safety. 75% of our operating budget is public safety, and the remainder is our other governmental services. As you can see, though, we're well below our revenues, which is good. When we throw in the capital needs, we are actually still below our revenues for the first 3 years. And again, the projection for a 5-year period is less accurate the further out you get on it. Any projection is. But again, we took great pains to go through all of our accounts and do the best we could to see where these were going to go. So the surplus or deficit, if you will, doesn't show up. The deficit is not until 2028. So I will let City Manager.
I was just going to say, if I may, when we talk about that capital, that represents about $4 million a year. And when we talk about, there's two types of capital. There's operating capital, and then there's project capital, what I call project capital, or capital that doesn't really have an ongoing tail to it. But our operating capital are for things like our vehicle replacements. I mean, $2 million of that roughly is our annual vehicle replacements. So those are important operating elements that we need to be able to do. It includes things like facilities, replacing HVACs, replacing park equipment that gets, that is broken or needs to be replaced. It could include some IT needs related to, some of our radios, or it includes kind of a general sense of what annually we need for police and fire equipment, new equipment needs, and replacing of, thermal cameras or replacing of SCBAs and things like that. So when we say it's capital, sometimes see that as one time. This is not really one time. That's truly the ongoing capital that we need in order to support all of our operating departments throughout the city.
Great point, City Manager. And
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, sorry, Mayor. I just had a question for the city manager. So is it correct in assuming that that doesn't represent, and maybe Mark knows the answer to this better than you do, but does ongoing capital doesn't represent stuff that would be in our CIP plan? Is that correct?
Our CIP program, like a new fire station or whatever.
Yeah, or just a variety of any one time. Like, I guess I'm thinking about things that we do that infrastructure that needs to happen on a regular basis, not a regular basis, but a one-time basis. We need to go and improve some infrastructure.
Right. It doesn't include big CIP projects. These are the ongoing, as the city manager pointed out, these are the ongoing.
So that stuff is
capital.
not included on this graph.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a projection. Of course, we show a deficit in 28. Doesn't really worry me. Again, projections as you get out further are less accurate. Each year we get a new number to start it with, and it'll adjust. If that deficit rolls into 3 years, less than 3 years out, you start to worry. Again, the $4 million in capital is needed, but it can be pushed from one year to the other year to take into account slow economic times, if they're of what we see of majority of the time, not again a 2008 type of slowdown. Yes.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, what does this tell me as a city manager? This tells me we've got a little bit of early warning of potentially some challenges we may have moving forward, particularly if our revenues are impacted even more or our expenditures are significantly higher. What do you do when you're in a situation like this? The nice thing about this, as you can see, year 3 is roughly about even. If we just kind of held tight. The problem is we know we have more needs than we probably have revenue in order to be able to support. Probably even next year. Well, maybe not next year, but maybe in other years. So, so this is a trigger for me as a manager to start saying, okay, we need to really consider our priorities, look at our core services and what those are, and really understand our levels of services and the things that we're doing, and start making some concepts, putting some concepts around if we had to, because what do? You either increase revenue or reduce expenditures in order to bridge that. And in these cases, I don't want to scare anyone, but it is this, I would look at this and say, okay, we've got some work to do. And that's really what I'm looking at when I see the forecast like this.
All right. Moving on, obviously, as we look at funding a debt service out of this, additionally, it doesn't, of course, help the projection, but just as a quick reference scenario, one was no grants. If we didn't get any grants and we had to cover the whole 22.9 with general fund, with the debt issue serviced by the general fund. And as you can see, the deficit becomes a big issue really quick. Again, hopefully very unlikely, 99% chance we're going to at least be at the scenario 2 level, so we won't need to.
Councilmember Rusing, you had a comment or question?
Yes, I would just like to interrupt, and I'm just very concerned that we seem to have skipped all the background information that is very important to let the community know how we got to this position. We've never mentioned Deepwell Ranch and how this is to protect the residents of Deepwell Ranch. We haven't mentioned that we've been in negotiations trying to avoid a lawsuit for 3 years with Deepwell Ranch and their principals, Ron James and Mr. Chamberlain, and also their representatives that are out here in the audience. And I think thirdly, it's very important that we hear from our airport director, Dr. Robin Sabata. She needs to weigh in on this to give clarity to the situation. Thank you.
At this point, I'm not going to have Dr. Sabata come up, and we can go ahead and talk about that, but I don't know that it's pertinent to this discussion right here. We're trying to kind of give a...
Excuse me, did I hear you say you're not going to allow Dr. Sabata?
I am not. Dr. Sabata is no longer an employee of the city.
As of about an hour ago, right? About 60 minutes ago, you just abruptly fired her because she spoke out during the executive session, honestly?
I don't believe that this is pertinent to this discussion.
She's still a citizen, and I want to hear from her.
All right. Well, let me get through my next 2 scenarios, and then we can go from there. Scenario 2 is with our highly likely grants, which are the bill money. And as you can see, even there, with all the purchases, we have some cash flow issues that we're going to have to address immediately in the next budget year. Start to address those, looking at different service levels and other things that can be curtailed, I guess, or modified. And then scenario 3, which of course we all hope is the best scenario, which is we get our highly likely and our likely grants. Still an issue. Obviously, these are all issues that need to be addressed. That's what the budget process is for. But again, our deficit is pushed out until 2027. With that, where does it come from? Again, just to throw this up, our 41,000, if we look at our general fund operating expenses less their net of their program revenues and any cost recoveries, 75% is coming to the public safety. As you can see, the others are there as well. This is where any cuts would have to come from, and obviously it would be challenging, but it's not anything we haven't done before. With that,
I'll interrupt a little bit here. At the end of this presentation, I will entertain comments from the public. So in the meantime, we'll complete our presentation here, and comments from the council will be entertained during the presentation. Mayor Pro Tem, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Mark, I have a couple questions going back to your scenarios that you showed. If you can flip back to those slides. I'm deeply skeptical of scenario 3, so let's set that aside. If we look at scenario 2, which seems possible, am I to understand that these realities that you're showing here, or these projections, I guess I should say, they include the cost of that debt servicing, the interest?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what these scenarios do.
But do these scenarios also include the Glassford Hill purchase?
No. Oh, yes, the purchase that we're looking at today, but not any park or staffing for a park.
Do they include a fire station?
No.
So not a single fire station?
Just the 5 we currently have.
Okay. So what would a fire station do to these projections?
Fire station, obviously, staffing a fire station is about 1,700 or 1.7 million a year.
Okay.
You got to build the fire station, which is a number that I'm not comfortable putting out there. It can be from 8 to 10 million, let's say. That can either be done through a GO bond, which is
tax increase,
a property tax increase, a vote of the citizens for that, or like we're proposing financing this, which is through an excise tax. So there would be
which would be more borrowing.
Yeah, which would be more borrowing.
Okay.
So yeah, you would have to do that. Could the general fund, without the airport land purchases, cover the cost of a new fire station? Probably not the construction of it, but possibly the operations of it.
Okay.
So you could go out.
So we are. I've talked to people at the fire department. We are, and I know this is slightly off topic, but entertain me for a moment here. We are desperately in the need, according to our fire chief, of at least 1, probably 2, maybe 3 fire stations. And what I see that this land acquisition is doing is forestalling that purchase for the indefinite future. Is that correct?
It does push the ability to do those things further down the road off, yes.
Thank you.
And I'll make the statement that would we would require additional revenue sources, such as a general obligation bond or some additional TPT type of tax that would have to be proposed and approved by the public.
Yeah, and again, depending on what you're referring to for the construction, again, if we didn't have the land purchase, we could possibly cover the staffing of such a fire station, but not the construction out of the tax base that exists. But you could expand it with a GO bond just for the construction, or do a TPT for construction and operations.
And I'll also bring up that, there has been some discussion and direction from council to look at some of our land acquisitions that we've had, or lands that we have that we might be able to sell in a reasonably timely way to help offset some of that as well. So there's a lot of possibilities to offset some of these costs, but they're not all guaranteed. And I think you kind of have to see the big picture.
I will make a comment that Mayor Pro Tem's description of the ADOT funding as a fat chance is probably better than a slim chance.
All right. Any more questions for me? Or
Councilman Tenney.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. One of the things that I think will be important for the public going forward and for me personally as I'm asked to make decisions around expenditures toward land acquisition is which of these things are absolutely necessary, bare bones in terms of safety, must do according to the FAA, et cetera, and which of these things are really a good idea based on, the following, a range of parameters that would be shown to us. It's my understanding that based on the discrepancy of the maps and the tables that were drawn years ago that were provided both to the landholders and ourselves that weren't discovered until relatively recently, there's some land acquisition that will absolutely have to happen. It's not really up to what extent we want to protect the airport. There's additional land acquisition that we need to make some hard decisions around. Is it worth that amount of money to provide that level of protection? Is that a fair description of the situation, Katie or Mark?
I believe that's a fair description. There's always options. I mean, good policy has a lot of policy options and criteria under which you evaluate that with. To your point, are these protections absolutely necessary? They are ones that historically the community through our general plan and through other policy, direction has indicated is important, but so have other priorities. We've had other priorities been identified as being very important as well. So in my mind, it comes to, we can get there, but it comes with trade-offs, and really that's the conversation.
Yeah, I hear that. I'd like to remain one of the lowest taxed, well-run cities on the planet, and at the same time do all of these great things that we're talking about. But it sounds like something's got to give someplace.
Yeah, my magic wand hasn't arrived in my office yet. Councilwoman can tell me.
Thank you, Mayor. Mark, before you leave, could you go back a few slides to this DWR Southwest approach map? Keep going.
next one. You got your
The,
controller.
Do you not
Yes.
have this? Is this slide? Okay. So if I'm looking at these parcels, you've got the a name, and then you have I'm assuming is the appraised price of each one of those parcels?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Yes. What is shown on these maps is what the original appraised price was, and that was, yes. So
Has that appraised price deviated on any one of these parcels that you have on the map?
Not from the city side, but we have had some conversations as we've been trying to negotiate to try to arrive at, again, the appraised values are kind of your, when you're in negotiations, they can go a lot of different ways. If you are negotiating, you may have to pay a little bit more. You may have to make some other concessions. The other option is, not one that everybody loves, but a condemnation. And in condemnation, the appraised value is kind of the bottom value. We're showing this more for context, but trying to give some sense of where we might likely land.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is if I'm just doing some quick math here. If I'm adding up these pieces of property, I'm not getting the 22,360 that you have. And I know this was mentioned before and I didn't hear the answer. There's a 5.2 or roughly $1 million offset there. What is the difference between the amount of these properties on that map, if I add those up? How are we arriving at 22 on your estimated cost? 22,360. I've got, and again, this is just quick math, 16,774. So what's the difference between that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's an important point. When you are talking about land acquisitions and you are talking with landowners who have development rights, there's usually some discussion and negotiation surrounding that you have to take into account. In the case here, I think one is that on the east approach. We do not, the value that's in the appraisal there is not going to be the ultimate value because we're getting a different appraisal being done for that. And I would expect it would be a little higher than that. Number one. Number two, we're in negotiations. So we're trying to negotiate so that we don't get the city in a position where we're paying what might be a condemnation price or a high appraisal price because they've got their appraisals as well. So this is just our city appraisals. This is not the negotiated value. So there's a little buffering in there for some of that.
But is that reasonable? Is that a percentage of
I believe it's
buffering?
reasonable.
5.2 is reasonable. And then the other part of that is the appraisal include the land on each one of these? Are they the same across the board? Is the appraisal on the land as it sits today? Or is the appraisal on what it theoretically could be if it were to be developed?
The appraisals are based on the valuation as of today. So it includes determinations based on entitlements and that kind of thing, but that's how it's determined based on the value as it sits today. And it includes some severance damages and so forth, damages that the property owner incurs by losing part of their property but not all of the property.
Okay,
so that's all part of how the appraisals are done.
Okay, so you're saying that some of the appraisals or all of the appraisals had severances figured in them in the appraisal?
Well, as an example, the CVID parcel, the north parcel, did not have severance damages because our proposal was to purchase the entire thing. So there's no severance damage in that type of event. But in any case where the part of a property is being taken but not the entire parcel, there will be some sort of severance damage, especially if there's any infrastructure or anything like that involved.
So let me ask you, would the value of a piece of property be reduced, for example, the piece that's right at the end of the runway, Zone 2, would that appraisal have taken into account that that is at the end of it's an impact zone?
It was taken into account, and I'm not an appraiser, so I can't tell you how much they devalued or changed the valuation. But both the uses, the entitled uses and zoned uses, and any other attribute that affects the value was taken into account. So, for example, right off of Zone 2, it didn't allow housing. So that reduced the valuation when that appraisal was done. And Zone 1, you can see it's 10 acres at $73,000, so very low amount because the zoning limitations are very high in that. So that is taken into account when the appraisal.
Okay, and one more thing before we go. I'd like the public to understand the appraisal process between the fact that the city would pick an appraiser, the landowner picks an appraiser, and then there is a third appraisal that takes place. Can you explain that process?
Yeah, and I'll say that is not relevant on the southwest, the north, and the south or the northwest. But on the east section, based on a contract, we had a process where the city appointed an appraiser, the landowner appointed an appraiser, and those two appraisers got together and appointed a third appraiser who's the one that does the appraisal.
So theoretically, it's an impartial appraisal.
So by contract, it's an impartial appraiser. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we don't have that appraisal value yet.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. The whole purpose of this exercise is we need to emphasize public safety. That is why we're purchasing this property. We need to protect the public from the crash zones, and it's for the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, we are entrusted with protecting public health, safety, and welfare. Originally, back in November of 2017, when this property was annexed, when it was originally in the county, all the proper zoning was in place. For whatever reason, I don't know, once it was annexed, all the zoning was voided and it became one zone, SPC, Specially Planned Community, which basically gave the developer free rein to put anything anywhere he wanted. As a result, as your council member, I am asked to issue permits for schools, churches, homes in the crash zone, and legally I have no leg to stand on. We all know that morally it's wrong, but nothing's been codified in the development agreement. We have no zoning. So as a result, we're having to pay blood money to protect the public. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, you had a comment?
I do, Mayor. I just want to say I take my responsibility for the public safety and welfare of the community really seriously, which is why I think that engaging in land acquisition at the cost of building a new fire station is fiscally reckless and destructive to this community. Thank you.
Well, clearly we have many very important priorities that have to be funded out of our general fund and our overall budget. So managing that budget, projecting revenue, deciding on what priorities are in what level of requirements are all something that this council will have to make their decisions about. I too feel that we have a obligation to the citizens and the residents of the North Prescott area that is growing so rapidly to make sure that they have equivalent public safety response times as other residents within the city. So that makes that a high priority. However, we had a council a number of years back that contracted with the developers in those areas and agreed to a development agreement that we now are dealing with the financial consequences of that agreement that had a number of deficiencies in how the development agreement was finalized. I was a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission when that development agreement was debated, and we looked at every one of those issues. And it was a very narrow vote of 4-3 to approve that with 21 conditions that had not been resolved. And because of the agreement on that, there were a number of definitions and vague descriptions that we now are dealing with the financial consequences of that. So we have an obligation to honor contracts. And we also have an obligation to make sure we make the best decisions for the community when it comes to public safety. So we have limited revenue, although I think with Dr. Sabata's very significant ability to attract grant funding that has been delivered over the course of her tenure, I think a total of nearly $52 million has been brought into the city to be able to handle some of these important expansions or corrections or safety areas that we have a pretty good chance to bring in more revenue to fund a substantial amount of these financial obligations. Not all, but a lot of them. And in a best case scenario, we might even be able to fund it all, but we don't plan on the best case scenario. We plan for sometimes the worst case scenario and then hope that we approach the best case scenario over time. But we do have a lot of grant applications in effect, and we expect that a lot of those will be granted. And I kind of share some of your skepticism when it comes to the Arizona Department of Transportation, because being on the Central Yavapai Metropolitan Planning Association, knowing that it's taken us 10 years to get funding for expansion of Highway 69, and that's funding coming from ADOT, budgeted, planned for 10 years, and we haven't turned over a shovel full of dirt yet. So we can use some of those examples of not really relying on funding coming forward as something that we have to consider when we put in our annual budget requirements. Lastly, I'll make one statement in some of the maps that were shown here. The runway extension that we're going to be dealing with Arizona Eco Development is not for heavier and more substantial aircraft service. It's for allowing the consequences of our altitude density concerns that we have here in our regional airport. And that means during the summertime when we're very high elevation and very high temperatures, the amount of weight that can be allowed on some of these commercial aircraft sometimes has to be reduced in order for them to take off safely. And we want to make sure that everybody who buys a ticket to use a commercial service is going to be able to get a seat on those aircraft. So by extending the runway, we know that the aircraft can take off safely, fully loaded. We also know that general aviation pilots and student pilots out at Embry-Riddle will also be able to take off more quickly and be able to gain altitude so they have less of an impact on the residents around the airport. So those are our primary plans for that extension. And I know I've heard from some people in the community that they're afraid all these big 737 Maxes are going to show up here and make their ability to enjoy their residential homes even more difficult. But that's not planned. It's not budgeted. And even if that were a scenario, we would have to replace all of our runways with much more substantial, heavy, weight-bearing runways, and that's never been contemplated. So with that said, Councilmember Rusing, you had
Yes,
another question?
I do have some questions, and I'd like to direct them to Dr. Robin Sabata, our recently passed airport director, but I think she should be able to ask these questions. She should be able to answer my questions about how the FAA acquisition process works for reimbursement. Thank you.
Okay, before we go to comments from the public, Councilman Shishka, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just have a comment, Mayor. Thank you. I would say to those who point fingers at other councils, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I think that it's easy to blame other councils, even going back into the early 2000s. But we're dealing with this issue now. And we've got to deal with this issue with what we have in the bank, what we've got going in the future, and pointing our fingers and saying, oh, wasn't me. That's not taking care of this issue. So, it's great to, say whatever, but let's deal with the issue now and deal with the issue going forward.
Thank you, Councilman Shishka. I'll entertain some comments from the public if anybody wants to address these issues. And I think Councilmember Rusing mentioned that Dr. Sabata, who apparently now is a member of the public and not a member of the city, certainly can address the council.
Mayor, I don't have any public speaker cards, so if anyone wishes to address the council, I do need you to complete a public speaker card. They're at the back table. If you just want to fill that out and return it to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
Is there a question that you would like for her to respond to?
Yes, I would like to have her give us a rundown about potential reimbursement by the FAA. They have a land acquisition program, and if we have the proper airport manager who is well respected and who has a well-established reputation and respect from the FAA, we might have a pretty good success at getting reimbursed by the FAA, and then we can move on and get those fire stations that we so very sorely need. And also there's other sources of funding for those fire stations like our state. Thank you.
Councilman Tenney, you want to make a comment before we hear from the public?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I was just wondering if it's reasonable for us to, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Sabata personally. I wonder if it's reasonable to assume that one of the parameters of receiving grants is the reputation that she's got with the FAA, or if that's something that they
Well, that's what I'd like to
would
ask
say
her.
that they're neutral on. So, for
I'd like
instance,
to find that out.
if Councilman Moore was applying for something, would he be more likely to get it than I would be, just because he's more well-known or respected, et cetera? My best guess is the FAA is going to tell us that it doesn't matter who it is that applies
That's
for
just your opinion. Thank you. I'd like to hear from the expert.
That's enough. We're out of order.
Yeah, that is enough, and it is out of order. Thank you, Mayor.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council, City Manager, Robin Sabata, Airport Director. And the answer to the question is yes, reputation and reliability matters.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, I said the answer to the question is yes, reputation and reliability matters. We are entitled to entitlements, and those entitlements, because of the fact that we're a commercial service airport, for items that are listed in the AIP handbook and put on the Airport Capital Improvement Program, we are entitled to those as long as we continue to have air service. The bill money that was mentioned earlier is the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. That is somewhere in between entitlement and discretionary, and it is much more certain. And so we feel very confident about the bill money being allocated to the uses that the city desires to use them for. So we feel very confident with that. The ADOT money comes out of a user fund. There was some controversy about the user fund historically because it was SWEP when it went through an economic downturn. One of the things that we need to follow up on is to confirm what protections are in place for the aviation fund within the state of Arizona, because it is not supposed to be used for other funds. It's actually registration fees from aircraft and other user fees, so it is supposed to be limited to those uses. That's not to say, Mayor Pro Tem Montoya, that your concerns may not be grounded in some validity from past practice where that fund was swept under the most dire of conditions. Additional funding that may be available may come through congressionally directed spending, and we actually do have some support for that if the federal government does complete the current budgetary process. That was actually not shown on the slide, but I think it's an important thing to take into account. With regard to what's happened at Prescott, it's been phenomenal for the last almost 6 years. The kind of growth that we've seen here. I just learned yesterday that Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University flew its 1.5 millionth hour in Prescott. It's a celebration that they're going to be having, which is amazing. Unfortunately, the number of flight operations doesn't get you more money. Being the 24th busiest airport in the country does not get us more funding. And so one of the things we're hoping this land acquisition does, and it's so important, is that, and we do have members of the community out here that obviously feel very strongly about this as well. If you have aircraft take off and you don't have some place for them to go, it doesn't mean they won't go down. So the best thing is to have open space available for them to go. Likewise, it's like a faucet. We have 320,000 operations a year here. That is one operation every 66 seconds between 0600 and 2200 at night. As a result, if we are trying to avoid overflight over sensitive communities, we need to have these open spaces in order to help facilitate a voluntary noise abatement program that will allow these major tracts of land to be that threading the needle between the sensitive users and the new home communities. So it's so important. And what I see is the major federal agencies really appreciate the fact that you're willing to honor your grant assurances, and they do reward that when you do honor your grant assurances. The third pot of money we talked about was discretionary, and it's called discretionary for a reason. And that is, it is up to the discretion of the FAA if you feel that you've met your grant assurances, or ADOT if they feel you've met your grant assurances, to determine where the extra money that they have goes. While there are rankings and prioritization, it is still up to the agency to determine whether or not your airport in your community is worthy of those funds, which are under high competition by a number of communities. I think we've demonstrated that I believe we've had more grants issued to this airport in the last 5 years than the previous 20, even if you correct for
And that was under your watch, in your tutelage.
Yeah, I did arrive in 2018, yes. And I continue to really appreciate the fact that this council has taken on the hard work. It's difficult, and I join with you on that by going out there and trying to fetch some funding with my little tin cup to be able to support your efforts here in the community to not only protect the future of the airport as a major economic generator, but protect the future of the community. Thank you for all that you have done to do this hard work. Deep Well Ranch had protections in it. What we found, though, is they weren't enough. So through this process, we're identifying additional land that does need to be acquired. And I want to be respectful of those landowners and of the people in the community who have land rights. But ultimately, we do have an obligation as the airport sponsor to continue to meet those grant assurances. And so that is what you are doing here today, and what you will be doing if you move forward and decide to make these kind of difficult choices. I do want to point out that there are grants for more than just airport, say fire stations, for example, and other infrastructure might be also grant-worthy targets for us to be able to pursue as a community. And I would love to work with my coworkers to identify those sources. And in fact, I am working with the fire department right now on a potential additional initiative that may also bring in additional revenues to support that type of development. So it is a big group effort here, and I think it's really important.
Councilman Tenney, you had a question?
No, sir.
Councilwoman Cantelme, you had a question?
More than probably a question, I wanted to address something that was said by Councilman Tenney, if you don't mind. Having been many years ago, I was asked to be part of a group, FOPA, we called ourselves, led by then Mayor Harry Oberg, and it was Friends of the Prescott Airport. We sat out there in the original terminal, Ernest A. Love Terminal, scratching our heads, trying to figure out, and it wasn't that we didn't have the money backing in the group that was there. Some of the members that were in the group were exactly Dr. Ascari. Ron James was part of the group. A lot of the city leaders, Michael Getty was there. People that we didn't have the connections that Robin did. Frank Ayers showed up one day, and he knew we were getting nowhere, and he took pity on us, and he said, I've got the person for you. This person is an expert in her field. She is published. She is consulted. This is somebody that is well known in this realm of airports. The FAA seek her out for direction. And I watched what she did over the last couple of years, literally single-handedly, and many times her hands were tied behind her back because I saw that. I was in the front row seat. So I'm going to tell you, yes, those connections do make a difference. You wouldn't get that loan. You wouldn't get that even a look at, just as we didn't when we had a mayor, until she showed up, because they know her, they trust her, they understand her background and her career. So I do want to say that. The other thing about this, I want to remind everybody, as much as we need services out in the North Prescott area, and I've said this before, and I'm not trying to lay the blame, but what I am going to be is realistic. Back when these DAs were negotiated, those things should have come up, and some of those costs of this development, this massive development in the north area, should have been addressed in terms of what it was going to impact on these taxpayers. Now here we sit with all this growth, and between Deepwell Ranch, Echo Development, some of the other developers out there, we've got almost 20,000 already approved units. 20,000 more units will be going up in those areas over the next several years. So those are things that we try to do, is keep up with those services. The city, the taxpayer, wants to supply those. We have a duty to supply those, but somehow they're going to have to get paid for. We missed that opportunity as a city back in the day when these DAs first came on the scene. Those things should have been asked. They're asked in every other large municipality. It didn't happen here. For whatever reason, it didn't happen. And here we are today. It's all coming home to roost. So we have to figure out, we need all those things, just as somebody else said. And I hope we can figure out a way to get a grant writer, get all the knowledge that we have out of a person like Robin Sabata and whoever else we can get to help this municipality figure out a way to get to where we need to be today. And that's what I have to say. I just wanted to respond to that. So that person over there, Dr. Sabata, was invaluable in getting that airport. And remember, between Embry-Riddle and that airport, for us here in Prescott, that's a $500 million premier combined economic generator for this region. And we're going to kick that to the curb because builders want to build right at the end of the drive or the end of the runway. You know, as a builder, I'm going to tell you, I don't understand the reasoning. There are so much land out there, but they choose to be at the end of the runway. I don't understand it. And remember, documented over 150 crashes in those areas. So you got to remember that. Whatever's going to shake out in this thing, in these negotiations, those are the facts. And I was there to see it. Thank you.
Mayor, if I may, I just want to make sure we stick to the topic of land acquisition surrounding the airport. I know that there's some bleed over, but I'm just worried we're exceeding the scope of the agenda item. And I know that there's some recent news, but I think it's not relevant for this meeting.
I'd like
Mayor
to
Pro
make a comment.
Tem.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Mark. So to bring it back to true here, maybe. Mark, let's assume that we have the world's best grant writer to go and get grants from the FAA and ADOT, and that ADOT doesn't continue their long storied practice of not giving money to rural communities. So let's suspend reality for a moment. At some point, we will have to use debt to service this acquisition. Is that accurate?
Well, yes, there are parts of this acquisition that I do not believe are going to.
We don't have $17 to $20 million just sitting around an account not doing anything.
No, sir.
Okay, and the reason I'm asking this is because there is a cost to borrowing. And,
Yes.
and it is a cost and a burden that we're going to put on to taxpayers in this community. And I think we have to think very, very long and hard about that cost and burden, because what those costs and burdens mean from a fiscal standpoint are raising taxes. So when you say that you want to do land acquisition around the airport, what you're actually saying is, I want to raise members of this community's taxes. I either want to raise it through land, property taxes, or I want to raise it through TPT, sales tax. So we're not, to your point, Mark, we are not the federal government. We don't get to print the money. We have to come up with it. We can't run a deficit. So I think there's nothing wrong with supporting the airport. There's nothing wrong with trying to protect encroachment around the airport. I'm in favor of doing everything we can within reason, but I also do not want to do it at the sake of our number one mission in my mind, which is the safety and welfare of our community that we achieve through police and fire protection. There are 5 things that cities do primarily. It is police, fire, water, streets, and garbage. Those are the things people care about. I've been out in the community at the farmer's market. Last Saturday, I was at True Value. Do you know how many people ask me about encroachment around the airport? Not a one. Do you know how many people talk to me about traffic problems? More than a dozen. People care about the police and the fire in this community. That's their priority. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we move forward.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I'd like to discuss a few points that were in the PowerPoint presentation. Number one, the attorneys for Ron James and Mr. Chamberlain representing Deepwell Ranch are asking us to pay more than the appraisal is required for this land to be purchased. They want us to pay more than the appraisal price and just give them money, I guess. And then number two, thanks to Dr. Sabata, recently in her research, she came up with ordinance number 5056-1596 that was passed on November 28th when the property was annexed, signed by Mayor Oberg. And in it is an ordinance that outlines land that needs to be set aside, open space that needs to be set aside to protect the airport, and the attorneys are arguing with that. They want us to buy land that's already been set aside for protection, for open space, and they agreed to, and now we're supposed to buy it from them even though we're not supposed to. But thanks to Dr. Sabata, she revealed this. Thank you.
Well, that was up there. Councilman Tenney.
I'm good. Thank you, Mayor. You can move on to someone else.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. I've remained quiet this entire time. Maybe you've noticed that. I've been listening and watching, and I'm conflicted as a council member. When I ran for election many years ago, I took that responsibility very seriously, that people were putting their faith entrust in me that I would represent what was important to them, what their values were. And many, many months ago, I expressed in a meeting where we were discussing airport land acquisition that I felt that the organization that was going to be benefited the most by this was Embry-Riddle. As has been mentioned, they operate an aviation school, and there's about 300,000 flights a year under Embry-Riddle. And yet the city is being saddled with the responsibility for land acquisition. And I don't agree with that. I think this should be a public-private partnership. I think Embry-Riddle should play a role in this land acquisition because it benefits them more than it benefits general aviation or commercial air. We have 4 flights a day, general aviation, 4 flights a day. And we're going to spend $22, $17, $9 million. And who's going to be saddled with that cost? It's you, the citizens. Your property tax is going to get raised, or your sales tax is going to get raised, or we're going to have to do a general obligation bond to pay for this land acquisition. And I understand that it's about public safety, but I totally support what Councilman Montoya has said. There's more to public safety than just airport safety and the possibility of a crash near the airport. It's our response times. It's the need for more fire stations. It's the need for more police stations. It's the need for more emergency response. And so I just want to share publicly that as an elected official, I am conflicted. And I understand the need to protect the airport, but I also understand that as an elected official, I represent a lot of constituents. And I haven't been out like Mayor Pro Tem Montoya talking to the public at the farmer's market or at True Value. I do have a lot of people that talk to me in my business. They want to talk about politics at my store. But people aren't coming to me asking about airport protection. A lot of it's about traffic, roads, water, basic public services, and those are issues that we need to address as well. Thank you.
All right, let me take the last 2 public comments, and then we'll wrap up this session.
Lisa Montgomery.
Hi, my name is Lisa Montgomery, and I live right smack dab in the middle of Deep Well Ranch. So I disagree with you, Mr. Montoya. You were at True Value. You weren't up at Deep Well Ranch asking the neighbors up there what they thought about having airplanes so close to their backyard they could look up and practically see the pilot in the cockpit, okay? We also have programs called ADP where we, as the public, can see how far they are flying above our houses. The FAA says 1,000 feet is supposed to be the target, but these people are flying 50, 100, 200 feet over our houses. So you didn't ask us. We've put every dime we had into these houses. This is our retirement. This is our life. Yes, this is important to us. Very important. Already this year, there were 2 accidents. If they had gone 100 feet, they would have been in somebody's backyard. So yes, we don't feel safe, but you didn't ask us that. I don't know. I'm just saying. Thank you.
Daryl Ostermiller.
City Council, City Manager. I just heard about Robin's firing about a half hour ago or an hour ago, and it's quite surprising. I am very anxious to see what the city manager will come up with for an airport director.
I'm
50%.
sorry. I really think we cannot talk about this because.
Okay. I'm president of Prescott Users Association. I'm AOPA representative, and I'm also on the Mayor's Advisory Committee for the airport. Timing's everything. There's been a lot of work going into this project. Director Sabata has gone beyond her calling. It's just amazing what she has done. She is a true expert in her field, and I'd like to thank her personally and wish her the best, and hope she comes out for a beer or two with me, because she deserves so much praise that I just can't express enough.
All right, I think that completes our discussion today on this airport land acquisition item on our study session. Obviously, it's a complicated and very expensive proposition to deal with all these different locations and the costs involved. So we will be considering this more in more detail as the developments proceed. And then, of course, we will be looking at this when we start working on our strategic plan and our annual budget workshops. Thank you all for attending. This meeting is adjourned.